Hello, everyone. So I thought that I'd do a video, which is something that on a topic that I don't normally do. And that is talking a bit about, from a spiritual perspective, what is going on in the world stage right now. And the reason that I'm sharing this video is for a few reasons. The first is that it is difficult not to notice the amount of suffering that is not only in the United States, but in the world. Basically, there are a lot of heightened energies out there right now. And the second is that I've certainly been in contact with a lot of people who are experiencing a lot of personal suffering as a result of um, what is going on on the United States stage as well as the world stage. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what is going on from a spiritual perspective. And then I'm going to offer some spiritual tools or spiritual guidance um, to help move people out of a place of freeze or a place of powerlessness. A lot of times we experience intense emotions and feelings of powerlessness because we feel like there's not anything that we can do about a situation. It's too large for us. And in certain cases, that may be entirely correct. But what we can do, armed with the right information and with particular knowledge and tools going forward, is that we can bring some resiliency back to our lives, some perspective, as well as kind of shore up our own selves and the selves of kind of the people around us a little bit better if we have the capacity to do so. So let's talk a little bit about spiritual patterns that are going on right now. I've talked about this quite a few times, but when I first started reading books, it was kind of in my libraries in the 90s. For those of you who have fond memories of card catalogs and that sort of stuff, I will join you in those fond memories. But what I found in those days was a lot of accounts from shamans and spiritual seers and all of that sort of stuff that dated back a long way. But somewhere in the 70s, what started happening was that spiritual healers and seers started talking about how spiritually disconnected we were becoming as a culture, as a world. There are a lot of reasons for this, but if you look at kind of the ocean floor or the basis for all of our suffering on a personal and collective level, it always has to do with disconnection. And so, what happens with spiritual patterns is that they can kind of persist on a spiritual level for a period of time. But what starts happening is that they start becoming more substantial, more concrete, more material, the longer that they have been around and have not been attended to. So, if we were talking about this spiritual pattern of disconnection, we were talking about a spiritual disconnection that happened in larger culture starting in the 70s, but really in the early 2000s, that spiritual disconnection became even more intense. This became a period of time in which people started moving away really from organized religion. There are a lot of wonderful spiritual and occult and pagan books from the 90s that kind of show this swing. But people started moving away from organized religion and some of the myths that make up our world. And for those of us in the West, those myths were largely Christianity based. And so even if we do not define ourselves as a Christian, those myths still play out in our psyches. Those myths still play out in our culture. You know, we still, even if we are the paganiest pagan to ever pagan on some level, we may need to reconcile within ourselves the concept of original sin. That's just one example. And the reason that I mention this breakdown of organized religion, is that it created the overarching myths and stories of our culture. And so, if you look at my book, The Spiritual Awakening Guide, I talk about conditioned layers of reality. What these really are grids or weavings. And what these weavings do is connect us at a smaller level, we have a weaving that connects us to our family. On a larger level, we have a weaving that connects us to our entire ancestral, line, to our community, to society, to the world. And if you get to these larger levels, it is about connecting to archetype, to symbol, to math, to story. Um, and so, what started happening spiritually was that some of these grids started very much breaking down. And people started, with the internet kind of coming into our culture, started moving away from the natural world more and more. Um, and this disconnect from the natural world, from the divine, from organized spirituality, from the myths and stories of our culture, gradually started breaking down the other grids in our grid system, those weavings that keep us connected, emotionally, spiritually, physically with one another. This very much reached a peak, or its sort of max physical manifestation, through the pandemic, which was the physical manifestation of our disconnection from one another on a physical level. So, what happens when we are disconnected like this, when we don't have all of these weavings connecting us together? Things like collective myths, collective stories, but also collective truths start going out the window, because we are no longer connected to that grid that tells us, okay, everyone, this is reality. This is the reality that all of us are intended to live in. This is the reality, and its structure, its energy, its emotion, this is our collective consensus of reality. And so those of us who are more sensitive may be like, while being normal in a reality that doesn't notice much, that isn't connected to much, being able to see or perceive more than that, I wouldn't want to be normal. That's very much a journey that most of us have taken, and most of us understand. You probably wouldn't have any idea what in the heck I was saying if, on some level you weren't on a spiritual path that kind of goes, a little bit deeper than your average bear, so to speak. Um, and so one of the things that I've really noticed, um, being a spiritual teacher and being on a spiritual path now for a long period of time, I've been interested in spirituality and psychology since the age of 10. So, it's been since the card catalog days that I've been reading and researching. And, I've been teaching now for 20 years. And I'm sharing all of this because there's been a distinct shift in spiritual culture since I've been a teacher. And that shift has everything to do with organized religion and the overarching Christian myths of our culture shifting. And for kind of a concise, simple answer about this, example about this, I will share that when I first started teaching, the people that came to me were afraid of connecting to the other because their religious and spiritual teachings that they were connected to told them that the other was evil, that spirits were unclean, they were dirty, they were out to do them harm. There's still a bit of that in our culture. But over the last 10 years or so, I have noticed a shift in particular in which the books that are coming out, in which the teachings, in which the students and people that come to me are so disconnected that they don't have even that fear of spiritual reality, even though some of it may linger a bit, is that they have absolutely no faith that there is anything beyond themselves, anything that they have connected to, that they can connect to that is larger than themselves. And so this is a difficult belief set to break through. And in part, it's because spiritual culture always meets the myths and stories of our day. And so, if the myth and story of our day is that there is no such thing as the divine, no such thing as the spirit realms, no such thing as connecting to something larger than yourself, what is going to happen is that even though books and teachers and all of that may come out with headings like, connect with your spirit guides, be a shaman, achieve enlightenment, all of that sort of stuff that has been around. Um, but it has the undercurrent now of none of this stuff is real anyway. I'll give a good example of this, which is kind of sad, but it shows kind of spiritual culture, spiritual patterns for where we are. One of the things I will share that there is a large interest in spiritualities that are talking about going past the ego. So getting rid of the ego, uh, experiencing beyond the self, beyond the I, experiencing the non-self, all of that sort of stuff. That is certainly something that can be experienced. It is a large gateway. What it is really intended to do is to reorient somebody to the world where, they perceive and experience reality differently. What has happened is that with the current myths and cultures of our day, is that it has been turned on its head. You will notice this with a lot of what we may consider evil, what we may consider ignorance, which is one of the largest evils out there. A lot of people don't like that word, but if you look into the thought of what evil is, it is always, that hypocrisy that we notice, something that is presenting itself as something else. And so I have found this trend of people claiming that they have no ego, and that means that they are superior or better to everyone else. And they're still experiencing the same amount of suffering. They're still experiencing, um, they're in fact experiencing an inflated ego rather than going through the process of experiencing the non-self or anything that you might want to talk about there. And the reason that I mention this is that, first of all, that's something that can be healed if somebody is willing to look at it. Because if you supposedly don't have an ego and that makes you better than everybody else, there might be something to look at there. Or if you're still experiencing a lot of suffering, even though you don't have a self, that likewise would be something to look at as well. But The reason that I'm mentioning it is because it so clearly shows the spiritual sort of ethos of our day, which is that people are atheistic in their beliefs and even atheistic in their spiritual search. People experience such this state of spiritual poverty where they are so disconnected from their bodies, from themselves, from nature, from the divine, from every source of nurturing and support that they latch onto these spiritual concepts, these spiritual ideas, because they desperately wish to experience something else other than the suffering and disconnection that they're experiencing. But they are not yet at the point where they can get rid of the overriding myth of our day, which is that of spiritual disconnection, that spirituality, that the divine, that anything larger than the self um, is real. It's something that can be connected to, and all of what happens as a result of that is people being in an extreme state of suffering that they cannot heal because they are so disconnected. And what happens in our connections is that we receive nurturing energy and we are able to let go of energies that are no longer able to serve us. So I talked about this a bit in my communal healing video, but if we have a small amount of suffering in us, say a small amount of anger, that's kind of like a small ball within us, and we may be able to handle that, to process that, to work with that on our own. What happens when that ball grows larger is that we need others to help us, to be able to process, to be able to heal that, to be able to witness that, to help us process it. We need connection with another person, with a group of people. Like I mentioned in the communal healing video, we need connection in some cases to the divine, to nature, to all of these sources of support. And those sources of support not only can help us to take on some of that suffering with us so that we are not alone in our suffering, but also can provide us back nurturing energy. And so we feel loved and cared for and worthwhile and valuable as human beings. And so when we are disconnected, what happens is that we stop up all of those natural connections that we once had. We armor ourselves, we shield ourselves, we shut ourselves down. We no longer connect to an earth that can naturally mulch kind of difficult energies. We no longer connect to a divine that can support us and make us feel held and loved. We no longer connect to people, to the physical world, to groups of people where we could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance. And so I'm mentioning all of this because the root of everything we are experiencing right now boils down to this pattern of disconnection. And as a result of this, people experiencing extreme amounts of suffering that they cannot resolve because they're disconnected, and they would require some form of connection, some form of trust in order to receive nurturing that they are not able to uh, open themselves up to on an individual level, but also because of some of the overriding myths of our day. Rugged individualism, all of that sort of stuff certainly play a factor in it. And so let's talk about another result of disconnection. What happens when we disconnect from these grids, these weavings more and more, is that we feel more and more alone. We feel, completely isolated, completely, um, separate from the rest of reality. And when we lose those connections, we lose perspective. We become selfish. This trend of narcissism that has very much blown up, in some regards, there's always this sort of trend that comes in and out. Like, in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a trend of, talking about sociopaths and psychopaths and stuff like that. And now it's narcissist. And in a lot of ways, it'll, probably go back to psychopaths or sociopaths or something, reasonably soon. There's always kind of that happens with psychology and with all sorts of holistic and even medical allopathic sort of diagnoses and stuff like that as well. But let's bring it back to the narcissism epidemic. What a lot of people are talking about, in some cases, truly is clinical narcissism. Somebody that would be diagnosed as having a personality disorder, as narcissistic personality disorder. But really, the bulk of what people are talking about is an immense amount of selfishness that people have, a lack of empathy that people have. It is difficult for us to have empathy when we are disconnected. We lose empathy as a result of being, disconnected from everything. We only are able to see and perceive ourselves, our own suffering, our own needs, and the thought of other people, the thought of connecting to other people, the thought of caring about other people, um, is the cost of that. It is the cost of disconnection, is people only thinking about themselves and losing their awareness of the world around them. And in talking about spiritual awakening, we could talk about it in a lot of different ways. I did a whole series on the chakra system, and so we can talk about how most people are in that first chakra state of awareness, where they are only aware of their own suffering. And this is totally understandable because if we have a considerable amount of suffering, we might not have time or energy or capacity to look past that. We need to tend to our, if we're drowning, we need to stop drowning and start treading water before we can start to be like, oh yeah, there are other people, in the lake or whatever. Um, the same sort of thing happens with spiritual awakening, is that somebody who we might consider as being asleep is somebody who has a very tight bubble around them. Their perspective is only on themselves, and other people are sort of, um, they're the main character. Other people are sort of, side characters, supporting characters in their world. As we spiritually awaken, that bubble opens, our perspective widens. We are able to see and experience empathy, and feel a sense of unity with the world and with the people in it. And as a result of that comes compassion, comes caring, comes the recognition that if one of us suffers, we all suffer. We are a microcosm of the whole. That person that is across from us who is suffering in some way, they are a reflection of ourselves. And so this epidemic of selfishness and even narcissism that we are experiencing is a result of that disconnection, because people are so disconnected and they lack the outlets to release that suffering and that misery. This is also what is happening in terms of patterns with the sort of cruelty that we see these days, especially in online spaces, but just in general, that the pandemic and the sort of effect that it had on a lot of our socialization is certainly a part of things on a psychological level. But on a spiritual level, if we are talking about the amount of disconnection that people experience, is that We tend to, lose social graces, kind of that social civility. We also become so immersed in our own misery, but we lack the capacity to know what to do with it. And so, what happens with our own self-hatred, with our own self-loathing, when we are not ready to look at it, when we are not ready to take responsibility for it, is that we project, we deflect. Online is a wonderful space for people to do this. Look at any, gossip site or news site. It'll be filled with people who are trying to find a home for their self-loathing. What happens with our self-hatred is that we try to find another person, um, another group, another class of society, in order to hate, because we are attempting to purge that hate from our system. We are ignorant that that is really a result of our own self-hatred, our own self-loathing, our own misery that we are placing out into the world. And so what happens with this collectively is that if we have enough of us that are not willing to take responsibility for our own self-hatred, our own self-loathing, that are projecting it outwards. This is going to sound, huge, but, that shadow really does create wars. It creates huge schisms between classes. It creates hatred between political parties. It creates hatred between, um, a celebrity, and their rival, or whatever is going on, and so a lot of the self-hatred, a lot of the hatred and animosity and sort of that evil energy that we are feeling in the world right now all boils down to self-hatred. People who are not at the point of awakening to be able to look at that within themselves. I'm going to talk about one more spiritual pattern, and I promise it is not all doom and gloom. I will go into what can be done about this next. The last thing that I'm going to talk about is that, and this is kind of the darkest shadow of things, is that in my videos on the chakras, I talked about how they are different perspectives and they are really different ways of operating in reality. And so somebody who is going through a spiritual awakening will start at spiritual childhood, spiritual infancy, and they will move through a process in which they eventually become a spiritual adult. They can find a certain resiliency in themselves. They're no longer repeating the patterns of their childhood. They're no longer energetically, spiritually sort of stuck in their childhood. They're kind of firmly in that adult place, in the present moment, so to speak. That is the end result of spiritual awakening in many ways, is to become a spiritual adult. And we talk about this as if that is something that all people want. However, if we are talking about the darkest shadows present in our reality, we talk about authoritarianism. And so one of the bigger patterns that's been happening in our reality for a while is the breakdown of authority. And in some cases, this has been needed. The looking at doctor, for example, as demigod, that needed to come down to earth a bit. But what has happened spiritually in our reality is that we have completely lost that tethering to authority. So people with facts, knowledge, experience, we don't pay attention to those. We pay attention to personalities. We pay attention to charisma. We pay attention to who is loudest, who hates the most, who can do the most obnoxious things. there's anything that really shows, our reality, it's those kind of like prank channels that, on YouTube, if you're familiar with those, that are not good natured whatsoever. They are purely getting views off of being obnoxious and, being a part of human misery. So, what has come into this vacuum in which authority once existed? People who spent their lifetimes specializing in a particular field to offer their expertise and knowledge. What happens when those people, when we no longer trust them, when we no longer value them? Is that that vacuum allows for people with false knowledge, basically people who have no idea what they're talking about, and for authoritarians to step in. And so one of the things that is really difficult to process, but it's incredibly helpful to do so, is that in that mentioning of spiritual adulthood, many of you watching this will probably be like, yeah, that's the goal for me, is to become that spiritual adult. Um, but there are a lot of people who wish to remain as spiritual children. They do not wish to take responsibility for themselves. They are looking for somebody else to take on that role for them, to think for them, to do for them, so they can remain spiritually, emotionally as children. And so what happens with this is that somebody will very much step in that vacuum to provide that role. For example, cult leaders in my field, this happens all of the time, is that if you have somebody that wishes to remain a child and what they're looking for is somebody to think for them, to do for them, to tell them what to believe, to tell them what their daily reality should be, is that they will always have people fall in line because those people then will not need to expend the effort to do those things themselves. They will not need to experience critical thinking, intelligent thought. They will not need to become a spiritual adult in their own right. They have a leader, teacher, someone telling them to who to hate, what to love, what to believe, what to feel, what is right or wrong. Ultimately, I believe in the classical definition of a guru or spiritual teacher, which is that the role of the spiritual teacher in an ethical capacity is somebody that is helps another to find their own light within, to find their own connection to divinity, to find their own relationship with God, with Goddess, with the divine. Um, and that is a beautiful thing. But what happens so often in our reality, and this is just one example, we could talk about companies, we could talk about politics, we could talk about entertainment business, show business, all that, whatever they call it those days, I feel, like, let's talk about show business, sort of thing. But could talk about family systems. And um, and so what happens in such a system is that the person in the child position is going to give away all their power to the leader. They are not going to find their own light. They are not going to become a spiritual adult. They are going to remain a spiritual child. And this happens all the time. I get contacted by people all the time that are looking for me to, first of all, be some perfected being, which I very much am not. I am human. And so some people, when they find out I'm human, run away and find somebody who's willing to pretend that they are perfect. Um, they're willing to engage in that persona, in that image, which again is another spiritual pattern of our area, very much associated with narcissism. where we are very concerned with our image and very much not concerned with the humanity or inner self underneath. But somebody who is truly engaged in the spiritual path with ethical spiritual teachers will uh, come into their own light. They will become a spiritual adult. They will engage critical thinking. They will have discernment, all of that sort of stuff. And so you can see the difference between this and in the modern world quite a bit, especially because I'm so versed with, kind of spiritual happenings and cult leaders and that sort of stuff. I will say that there is that evil, kind of sociopathic cult leader that is out there. We all know stories about a lot of them. I will find that the most pernicious form of this actually happens from really good-hearted spiritual teachers who feel very sorry for their students because they're in pain and suffering and they wish to be kind to them. But in doing so, what they are doing is treating them like children. There's no expectation for them to grow. They are simply being their mother with, you know, and kind of unrequited need to care for other people that likely comes from a childhood of caretaking or needing to care for others before themselves. But um, spiritual paths do require a fair amount of growth if somebody wants to move into spiritual adulthood. And so the last thing I will mention, I just kind of mentioned here, but is that anti-intellectualism has always been an issue in our world. But if we are talking about authoritarianism of people who want control, want to remain in control, what they will do is that they will cut out the original thinkers. They will cause for them to be evil. So artists, original thinkers, poets, that sort of stuff. Uh, and they will also cut out any thoughts that are not their own. And so we have a vicious strain of anti-intellectualism happening in our world right now. You can look at the literacy rates of children these days, and it is very disheartening. I'm friends with quite a bit of teachers, and the way that they talk about their students in college, university, as well as students, in lower grades, reading several years below where they should be. Uh, it is a difficult situation. So I've talked about a lot of this, and a lot of it seems doom and gloom. And I recognize that, but I always think that information is helpful to be able to see clearly. Because if we are able to see clearly, if we are able to have a certain amount of perspective, that creates a certain amount of resiliency. We can see through what is happening. We can see what is happening from a more removed perspective, which means that we are not engaged in that overwhelmed state. We are not engaged in a state in which our own mental health suffers so greatly. We can see clearly kind of things that are going on from a psychological, from a spiritual standpoint. It really does help to understand things. The real question is on a spiritual level, what we do about this. I will say that there are wonderful resources out there for talking about what to physically do in this time. There can be anything from, you know, I'm always a huge fan of if you are in a position to be supportive to your local community, to do things like text friends or call friends you haven't talked to for a while, to be there for others, to even do simple things like hold the door open for somebody, say hello to somebody else, something like that. We are losing those threads of connection where, we, just say hi to somebody that we don't know, or say hi to a neighbor, introduce ourselves to neighbor. There's also always, volunteering in your local community, volunteering to help animals, volunteering to help food kitchens, whatever your thing is, there is some place in some way that you can be of service to other people. And that certainly helps people get out of freeze states and feelings of powerlessness. On a spiritual level, there is a lot that can be done. The first is that it is very easy for a lot of us to project our own shadows onto some of the louder elements of reality, some of the louder people, some of the more demonstrable forms of hatred, of evil, of whatever words that you want to put onto it. If we are willing to look within at which parts of ourselves are not loving, which parts of ourselves still have self-loathing, which parts of ourselves feel like they cannot belong, which parts of ourselves feel disconnected ultimately. That work means that our energies of division, of ignorance within ourselves, of self-loathing, of self-hatred, our childhood issues, whatever level we are working on, are not going out into the collective. There is a lot of necessary ancestral work that is done at this time because the energies that we are experiencing didn't just suddenly come up, a couple weeks ago or a couple years ago. They have been coming through for long periods of time, for hundreds and thousands of years. And so those of us who are able to do ancestral work can to solve, to heal, to release patterns, to release karmic patterns, to release darkness, to release the unhealed ancestors in our legacy so that they can move on. Our world on a spiritual level is still extraordinarily clogged with the dead, with people who have passed away, but they are still experiencing suffering. So they're still on this plane, and that energy is still present there. And by you doing your personal healing, by you doing ancestral healing, that allows for that entire ancestral line to move forward, to move on, and that heaviness does resonate in a big way, as does the lightness into the world once you do that level of healing. If you are looking for really deep resources for healing, yes, I am going to suggest my books. I'm going to suggest the Body Deva book. One of the things that very much is happening that is shown so clearly through our spiritualities, but also in our world, is our disconnect from nature, means our disconnect from our own nature, our disconnect from our bodies. We have so many head-based spiritualities out there that are completely disconnected, disassociated from reality, from the present moment, from the physical body, from the feminine. And so what people can do is to start connecting to the body. I suggest my book, The Body Deva, which processes some pretty heavy stuff through the body. It can be emotions. It can also be things like working with ancestral patterns and healing them through the body, things like that. Past lives, all of that sort of stuff. The other thing that I would share is that to be the light the best that you can. All of us have distressing thoughts. All of us experience emotions about things that are happening, but we can, in a conscious way, decide that our thoughts, our actions, our beliefs towards others can be ones of light. They can be ones that are loving. There can be ones that are connecting, rather than being ones that are bringing more hatred and separation and othering into the world. Look at every person that you hate, every person that you dislike, every group that you other, that you cannot see yourself in, as a division within yourself, and you will get to the deepest shadow work that there is. there is a real need for people to connect to the natural world while we're still able to. So do all those things, contemplative walks in nature, appreciating the stars, appreciating the sky, appreciating the birds, the grass under your feet, however you can get that nature in, where you can feel a part of the woods, part of the world, is necessary and helpful. On a spiritual level, even if you are not there yet, um, I will share that faith for me is a felt thing. It is something I feel in my body. It is something that I feel in my heart. I recognize that people are not there yet, but it's helpful to provide maps. And so, whatever your form is to connecting to the divine, whatever your spiritual path is, whatever manifestation it is, look at the parts of yourself that experience that sort of atheistic scorn, that experience contempt, that are so immersed in scientific materialism that there is no room for wonder, there is no room for magic, there is no room for play in the world anymore. And so you can engage in all sorts of spiritual practices thoughtfully. And you can also do things like engage in active prayers. So prayer to God, prayer to Goddess, prayer to the universe, even if you are not at the point of feeling a connection or, that part of you is experiencing doubt, understand that doubts are natural and that you putting that intention, putting those thoughts out there, hey, spirit guides, hey, goddess, hey, universe, I have a desire to connect with you, to, feel more connected with you, sharing your prayers, sharing your intentions, sharing your desires. We, on a magical level, very much speak things into being. And so even if we're going into silent prayer, we can very much start that process of cultivating a relationship with the divine, which will someday be something that we can experience more fully and experience as a felt thing, which is a beautiful thing to experience and to feel. The last thing that I will share before I go, because this is long enough, is that Saint John of the Cross, he was the first one that came up with Dark Night of the Soul. And in his original intention of Dark Night of the Soul, he found that the darkness, he was imprisoned by the Carmelites, so he knew darkness well, was that was an optimal time for growth and for transformation. And so those of us who are able to can understand that what is happening on the world stage, what is rising in our collective, is really something that we can work on within ourselves as well. It is optimal time to do this. So those energies are up in the collective. We can work on them much more deeply within our individual being. We are the cosmos. We are the world on a certain level. We contain the world on another level. And so, but on a shadow work level, what is going on in the outer world is reflective of what goes on within ourselves. If we are willing to look at it and work on it, it really, really helps. I do suggest my book, Shadow Work for the Soul, for doing that type of work. But the last thing that I will share is that certain amounts of darkness, and I kind of compare this to a huge wave, to a wave of the dark feminine, coming into our reality. What that huge wave does is that it brings up all of that nasty stuff, all of that ocean floor ooze and garbage and, all of that sort of stuff so that it can heal things for the vast majority of people, in order to notice them, in order for them to be aware of them, need to be so loud, need to be so obvious that they have no other choice to look up and to register them. And so this does create awakening on not only a personal level, but also a collective level. We get so immersed in that first and even second chakra, like immersed in our own pain and our own suffering in our own lives. We don't really look outward, especially when we are going through times in which we are experiencing basic comfort. What happens when reality becomes dark, when it becomes uncomfortable, when it becomes super noisy, super heightened, is that that actually awakens people. It actually catalyzes people to take action, to take notice in ways that times of light uh, do not offer. So if you take anything from this wave of the dark feminine that we've certainly been experiencing for quite a while, I'd say, since, you know, I used to make fun of all the 2012 prophecies that were like famous in like the late 90s, early thousands. And then I'm like, oh, that seems about right. But probably about since like about 2015, I would say this most, present day darkness, this present day, kind of wave of the dark feminine kind of arising. Is that know that during this time you can individually experience exponential spiritual growth and kind of take some guidance from Saint John of the Cross, who found that in prison that he was able to find his light. And so I do hope you find yours as well.